Hello, welcome everyone to our weekly wine roundtable and seminar. My name is Mark Vernon. I'm the CEO here at Ridge Vineyards, and I'll be the host today. I think I'll just go ahead and start right off by introducing our panelists. So on my left, on the screen, at least on my screen, is David Gates, who's our Senior Vice President of Vineyard Operations and takes care of all the vines and delivers great fruit to the winemaking team. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Mark.
On my on my right, I've got John Olney, who's our COO and head winemaker at the Lytton Springs Winery. And we're going to have down below Eric Baher, who is our Chief Operating Officer and head winemaker at the Montebello Winery. So thank you for joining us today. I want to again give you a little bit of an update on our status here at Ridge. Our tasting rooms remain closed, although we may be getting closer to the time when we might be able to reopen, but that has not occurred yet. So we still are selling lots of wine on our website, and you can also call us on the telephone or send us an email if you're interested in purchasing. I should mention that the 4 wines that we're going to be tasting here today, which are all library releases, are currently available, and you can find them on the website if you haven't purchased them already. So they are there, but they are in fairly limited quantities because these are library releases, and the amount of each of these wines is pretty limited. So if you are at all interested, I encourage you to get your orders in soon. I'm happy to report that all of our employees remain healthy. Nobody has gotten sick with the coronavirus, and we're working hard to keep it that way. And the health and safety of both our employees and our customers are preeminent in our minds, and we'll continue to stay very focused on doing what we can to prevent anybody from getting sick. If you're interested in joining our conversation today, there's 2 ways to do that. One is to converse amongst yourselves using the chat function here on Zoom, which I can already see quite a number of people have jumped in and started saying welcome and telling us who you are and where you're watching from. If you have specific questions for the panelists, please use the question and answer function in Zoom, and we'll try to get to your questions, and I'll pose them to the panelists online if we can. Sometimes it's easier. We may just type a response to your particular question, so bear with us. But it makes these events and these seminars much more enjoyable if they can be interactive and we get your participation and ask all of your interesting questions. So please feel free to do that. So without much more ado, I think we're going to jump in and start tasting the first of the 4 wines. And I'm going to turn over to Eric Baher, who I think had something to do with the making of this Chardonnay, this delicious Chardonnay. That
just
taste.
a little bit.
Tell us about this wine.
Yeah,
right?
well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be joining you from within the Montebello Winery. The Chardonnay here from 12 Vintage, this is the estate selection. So this comes from a group of parcels and barrels within those parcels of kind of the most fruit-forward, elegant wines of the vintage. So, you know, we have roughly 6 parcels on the mountain that grow in different parts of the Montebello, from as low as about 1,500 feet on up to the very top here at 2,700 feet. And so they're not uniform. There's lots of slopes, there's swales, there's lots of variation to water resources within those 6 areas. And so as we're harvesting, we go through, we sample, we taste, and we separate out the most water-stressed vines and tend to pick those first. And then the vines that have better water resources, what we call green vines, that are much more lush. That fruit takes usually a bit longer on the vine to ripen. Those parts of the vineyards will come in towards the end of the harvest. And so as each batch comes to the winery, we load it into a press, gently extract the juice. That juice sits overnight in a tank, and we'll just kind of let it rest and We'll put cooling on it to bring the temperature of the juice down to about 55 Fahrenheit. The next day, we'll mix the tank. We'll make sure that to resuspend any of the solids that settled out overnight. Those solids carry with them micronutrients that the natural yeast will utilize during the fermentation. We'll make a small addition of SO2 at the start. That helps kind of select for Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the primary fermenting yeast. It kind of inhibits some of the other non-fermenting yeast that come from the vineyard with the juice. So it allows for the natural yeast fermentation to begin in a very healthy way. With it being a cool temperature, as we barrel down in the old cellar below me, it's earth temperature. And during that primary fermentation with the natural yeast, it generally takes about 2 weeks before we see any signs of fermentation, where you can actually start to smell a little bit of carbonation, and you'll feel a little bit of fizz on the juice. And then just gradually the yeast will ferment. And why I like to do cold fermentation is it creates more stress on the yeast. You know, it's a tougher environment for them to ferment and multiply and work through. Keeping it cool, it helps really preserve a lot more of the aromatic compounds that come from the juice as the yeast ferment. And as the yeast stress, they also create a lot more essential oils that will slowly come into the wine after they're done fermenting. As we do barrel stirring, the yeast cell walls break open, they lyse, those oils come into the wine, and it just adds more body and texture to the Chardonnay. So as we're working through fermentation, the next step then is the natural malolactic. That's converting malic acid to lactic. It helps stabilize the wine. Being on this mountain in a cool environment near the Pacific and the San Francisco Bay, we have these unusually cold nights here, and that helps drive in very high acidity into the grape. So we actually count on a full malolactic helping to kind of soften the real intense acidity that we have. Still an acidic wine, but later on, having malolactic completed, it also allows us to be able to bottle the wine without any filtration. If you don't carry out a full malolactic, eventually that malolactic would happen in bottles. So most winemakers that inhibit malolactic would then have to sterile filter the wine to separate it from the malolactic bacteria so that they create stability. In our case, we want it to go totally natural all the way to completion. Then we're tasting, we're looking at every single barrel, and then we'll piece together those that really have the best expression of the vineyard site, as well as good fruit, nice, elegant, oily texture. Those are assembled as the estate, which then is generally bottled kind of in this case, this vintage was bottled right as we ended harvest of 2013. So coming right to the end, we got it racked off clean with gravity clarification. We got it to bottle, and it's just been tasting amazing ever since this wine was released. I love our Chardonnay with bottle age on it. And this, to me, the 12, is such a special year. I mean, it was beginning of a drought. You know, the vines had the carryover water of 11. So they actually really were in good balance as far as, you know, growing conditions and water resources. And it really created a gorgeous Chardonnay with a lot of really great complexity. And as it's aged, the fruit that was so primary is now becoming more the secondary kind of baked pineapple, upside down cake, creme brulee. I mean, there's all these really wonderful notes that are starting to show in the Chardonnay. But maybe Dave can talk about the vintage a bit and kind of how much acreage we're growing here.
Sure. So in 2012, we were a little over 20 acres of Chardonnay. And how big was the Montebello Chardonnay selection that year?
It ended up, I think it was about 800 cases.
Yeah, so it was a decent size. So
it's a good size.
Like,
I mean, it's just one of those quality vintages.
Yeah, and it was actually of the teens. It was from the vineyard side. It was a fairly easy vintage. there was just enough rain to help the vines out, like has happened this year and some of the other years of the big drought. We get enough spring rain to kind of help the vines along, and that spring rains are very important because that all that water is available to the vines. And we don't have any irrigation on these older vines of Chardonnay, just the little young block of at Rouston, which was just coming into production in 2012. And if we got anything from there, it was very small amount. I remember the harvest this year was pretty easy too. So, well, easy. Easier.
And I think it was pretty fast.
It was really fast.
It was like, I think done all in like 5 days.
Yeah, it was another one of those, kind of like our East Bench Zinfandel. It's one of those hurry up and wait, and then all of a sudden, boom, you've got everything's
it's
ready.
Already. Yeah.
But that's farming. That's what typically it ends up happening more times than not.
Yeah. So Eric, we have a couple questions about the Chardonnay. So one is to maybe talk about how does our Chardonnay compare stylistically to white Burgundy, and then also to explain a little bit of the difference between the estate Chardonnay and the Montebello Chardonnay.
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as like the selection between Montebello and estate, it has a lot to do with just how intense the fruit is. I mean, the very strong fruit forward lots that are really oily and elegant tend to be the basis of the estate assemblage. Montebello kind of goes out to another realm of dimension of like really strong limestone minerality, higher acid, not so fruit forward, but has more array of kind of mountain character, mountain fruit, a mix of more kind of, I'd say like, yellow plum and, maybe kind of green, slightly green pineapple. So it's not just like a punch of fruit. It's something that's actually really deep and complex and takes longer for it to develop in the bottle. So we don't always make Montebello every year. It's really only made on very specific vintages where we just happen to find that in the cellar from those select parts of the parcels that are brought in. And then within the barrels, because with natural yeast fermentation, we could barrel down the juice among a group of like 10 different barrels. And because each one is its own fermenter, whatever natural yeast mix of one barrel could be different than the next. And it's going to create a lot of different flavor profile within the juice. And so it becomes a very complex assemblage where it's not just a piece of ground that defines what is going to be Montebello. It's within the barrels that are from that particular piece of ground. So it gets really down to minute levels of detail of assemblage. And as far as the Montebello is definitely, white Burgundy. I mean, without question. I mean, the character, the strong minerality. I often see it taste very similar to Chazon Montrachet. The limestone, the acidity, the more of a citrus-like quality of fruit. The age along the same line. The estate, is more Meursault. I mean, very just good fruit, nice texture, oiliness, a very robust Chardonnay. I mean, we're using American oak on these wines, so we're not trying to emulate any of those wines. It is something that we end up producing just by pure luck of having just a great piece of ground. And the fact that we're also using a fair amount of neutral barrels. So we're not trying to make the wines from the oak that we're using. It just happens to be that the oak that we bring into the cellar is American oak, for us. We've got a lot of Kentucky oak barrels and a little bit of French as well, but mostly American.
So Dave, talk about, again, the coolness of the climate and the spots where we are growing the Chardonnay at Montebello.
Yeah, so Chardonnay, it's funny that we can grow both Chardonnay and Cabernet in the same parcels and kind of up and down the hill. Our Chardonnay thrives, though, right at about 16 to 1,700 feet, somewhere in there, which is where the inversion layer lays in. So we face the bay, not the Pacific Ocean. And the bay here on the south side will fill up with fog in that when you get the weather conditions just right, like this morning. And the cold air rushes over some of like through the Golden Gate Bridge and over the hills on the way to Half Moon Bay and fills in the valley. Well, that lifts kind of warm air up, but that inversion layer right where the fog hits or stops is typically about 56 degrees, something like that. So anything below that is nice and cool in the mornings, at night and early mornings, but then it actually warms up quite a bit during the day. As it warms up, it pushes the kind of mixes with that cool air from the fog and pushes that further up the hill. So the Chardonnays that we grow a little bit higher up on the hill, they tend to be a little less fruit forward and they show maybe a little bit more minerality, and they get ripe a little quicker too, even though their bud break is a little bit later than further down the hill. So it's a nice mixing, a nice complexing element. But I think that's really key to our Chardonnay. The two key things is the inversion layer that keeps the nights and mornings really cool and brings the days up warm enough to get it ripe. And then also the limestone influenced soil that is typical of Montebello.
Yeah, and what I like about the upper parcels is the eroded topsoil. So the vines are really deeply embedded in the limestone. And so you do see such a strong imprint of the Montebello character in the grapes. And the vines are stressed too. So the berries are smaller, the clusters are smaller. That just leads to juice that has the ability to really get flavor before sugar accumulation. So you can actually come off the vine and be a lower alcohol level, which is that general direction we've been going. I mean, we've been bringing the fruit in earlier every year, trying to get in under, at 14 or just under, really doing what we can to really make a classic long-lived Chardonnay that's got even better acidity by picking earlier.
So Eric,
but what does John think about the Burgundy? I mean, the Burgundy question, and since he's got the most experience with Burgundy.
Well, I mean, I think that, there's no question that even though what's interesting is even though we are at Montebello, we're in for California, a cooler climate, it's still warm enough, certainly, for us to get full ripeness and that richness that we get. And years ago, or maybe not that long ago, in Burgundy, it was very difficult for them to get that ripeness. But as climate change has taken effect, I feel like their wines have become sort of bigger and rounder and richer. So they're, to me, the two styles of wine, if that's what you want to call it, are actually converging as where they used to be a little more farther apart. But in the end, regardless of where they're actually from, I think it's amazing just the set of circumstances we have at Montebello that allows for us to make such a consistently rich, but at the same time such a precise wine that has such definition.
And I second that, and for me it's also a hallmark of the Santa Cruz Mountains for Chardonnay. It's a great place to grow Chardonnay. Even either side of the San Andreas Fault, it has all that California rich and ripeness, but always a nice backbone of acidity.
And then maybe with global warming or climate change that we're seeing, I mean, with the prediction of the coastal areas getting colder and foggier, maybe we'll actually start to get to a point where it's challenging to grow Chardonnay here. And we'll have more acid. We'll have, maybe more kind of old style Burgundy, which would be kind of cool.
I think Dave will tell you it's always challenging to grow Chardonnay.
Well, it is. Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge is going to be the mildew pressure from those wet fogs that touch the vine. So we're always up against that. I don't remember 12, though, being a really foggy summer. I just remember it was dry.
It's very nice. It never got super hot either, which was great.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna move on because even though there's a lot we can continue to say about the Chardonnay, but since next week's seminar is going to be 100% focused on Chardonnay, that'll give us an opportunity, give the panelists an opportunity to go into even more depth on the Chard. And if you're watching today and you're interested in more detail on the Chard, by all means, tune in next week for a very in-depth tour of our Chardonnay. So with that, let's jump to the second wine, which is the 2015 Boatman Jake's Block Zinfandel. And John, you made this wine, so can you tell us about the wine?
Sure. So the Boatman Vineyard, named after Tim Boatman, who owns the vineyard and sculpted the beautiful terraces that make up the vineyard. It's fairly new for us. 2014 was the first vintage we made from the Boatman Vineyard, and being up on the terrace with various expositions, the vineyard is divided into 6 or 7 different blocks, which we harvest individually. And in 2015, it was only the second time we'd made it, but I was really struck by this one particular block, which is called Jake's Block. It's named after Tim's son, Jake. And, coming back to it over and over in the fermenter after it went through malolactic, the production team here and everyone just really looked at it and said, there's this sumptuousness, there's this elegance to it that is really, really, it's kind of rare for Zinfandel. And, it almost has sort of a Pinot Noir-ish kind of character to it, which, is I think one of the thing that's probably what's most intriguing for me about Zinfandel in California, and why I think it's certainly, there's a good argument that it's certainly one of the California grapes, is that you can plant it in so many different places, and it really just sort of absorbs the surroundings. In other words, it changes its character depending on where it's being planted and where it's being grown. And the Boatman Vineyards in the Alexander Valley, it's full exposition. Lots of sunlight, very ripe, and yet you get this elegant expression with beautiful fruit, just sumptuous, really silky tannins. So it was a real surprise and a real find for us, and we've gotten great feedback from the wine in general. And this was the first time that we took a single block on its own and did a real small release. I think there were only several hundred cases of it, but it's tasting great right now. I mean, I think it's not gonna. Oh, hey, there's Tim.
He likes to hunt, I see.
Yeah, that's the man cave.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where Tim likes to serve us his spaghetti and meatballs there. And there's a great picture of the terrace and the team doing harvest right there on the terraces. Yeah, it's beautiful. Dave, the soil is really it's really unique, actually. I mean, it's so rocky. I mean, it almost looks like Chateauneuf de Pop if you've seen those big round rocks. It's kind of, Dave, don't you think it's fairly unique for Sonoma County, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's from an ancient washout, probably of the Russian River. At one of the, I don't know, maybe it's not as old as probably about 40 million years ago, but it's all river run and rock and whatnot. And then it had been silted up again with one of the ocean rises that actually came up and kind of flooded it. And then it, of course, recently it's been eroded away. Very different soil from just across the freeway, or even at the front block. He's got a little section that's at the base of those hills. That's very different soil. That's almost all pure gravel. Up on the hills, the dirt in between all those old river rock is more clay loam, which is great because it does hold water. Otherwise, that place you couldn't grow anything on it. And yeah, Tim did a great job of sculpting those terraces And there are a few of them, you have to know the ranch before you start driving around in it, because there are some where they either dead end or you don't want to go the wrong way on a couple of those terraces. But yeah, Tim's a good guy. Yeah. And Jake is, his son Jake is taking over a lot more of the farming these days too.
And they're all
it's
head
a great
vines,
story.
right?
Yeah, it's all head
pruned?
pruned.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah.
Very classic style then. I mean, to me, this kind of like if we picked out just 100% Zinfandel at Geisavo, it would be kind of very similar to this. You know, that same style of fruit, you know, the elegance. Yeah, it's very Alexander Valley, West Alexander Valley Zinfandel like. Yeah, elegant.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
And I think what really helps this this whole vineyard out really well is it basically faces east and a little bit north. There is one section on the back side of the terraces that faces to the west, but it's tucked up against some higher hills further to the west. So it gets plenty warm in the morning and by noon, but then the heat of the day, 3-4 o'clock, it does start to cool off a little bit quicker than you would even across the freeway on the valley floor, where it gets full sun all the time. So I think that really helps preserve some of the delicateness of the Zin.
Mm-hmm.
So Dave, there's a question, is Tim doing the vineyard work with tractors, or is it hand work, or explain a little bit more?
So he does a little bit of both, but he has two types of tractors. He's got some wheel tractors that they save for just probably about 3/4 of the vineyard, and then he's got a little crawler that which is a track layer tractor that's a lot more stable on slopes, that he does the steepest sections of the vineyard with.
Yeah.
And he carved all those terraces. He knows it like the back of his hand. So he's really good, and his son Jake is learning it as he goes too.
Oh.
So another question, John, was can you, I don't know if you can compare or contrast the 15 Jake's block with the 15 Boatman Zin?
Well, I think the Boatman, the entire, in other words, the other blocks that we put together, there's a little more richness and texture in terms of the body of the wine and the structure of the wine with the Boatman. I mean, for me, the Jake's is just all this round, very immediately accessible fruit. The wine's aging terrifically, I think. I mean, I'm amazed how fresh the fruit still is. But the fruit is much more focused, I think, in the Jake's block, whereas with the Boatman in general, you're getting sort of a darker, more plum kind of fruit and more minerality out of it, and a little more structure. So texturally, it's a different wine, and it sort of moves over towards the darker spectrum. But they're still clearly of the same family.
Great. So we've got a question I'm going to pop in, and maybe John, you can answer, and Eric can answer a bit too, because I think we're getting some interest in the discussion around the fact that we use natural yeast for our fermentations, as opposed to a cultured laboratory, single strain of yeast. So talk a little bit about what does using the natural yeast that come in on the grapes do in terms of the impact that might have on the flavor or complexity of the wine.
Wow, that's a whole session. We could do about a year.
Do a whole seminar on that, right?
Yeah. But I mean, I'll mention a few things, and then Eric can obviously add to it as well. I mean, I think that one of the big differences, I mean, just to begin with, is just understanding the whole mechanics of it, in the sense that wild yeast, first of all, exists with a huge and very complex variety. So when we talk about wild yeast, we're talking about quite a few different yeasts, and we're not talking about one manufactured genetically identical yeast. So you're getting more variety to start with natural yeast. The other thing that's very important is that when as yeast comes in on the grapes, there's some here, there's some there. The overall concentration of the population is fairly low when it first comes in, and it builds up slowly during fermentation. That contrasts in a very big way with commercial yeast, where you're taking this sack of yeast, you're putting it in the wine. It's been manufactured to be very, very vigorous. It finds itself in a high sugar environment, and it makes the fermentation go immediate. And it really, if anything, you have to go to work to try to slow the fermentation. And it's very thorough, so thorough that it just ferments everything very, very quickly. And you don't get the complexity that you do when you have a longer, more drawn out fermentation that you have with natural yeast. So those are just those are a couple of basics. Eric can add to that.
I agree with all of that. For me, you definitely see the impact on the wine quality by the kinetic of the fermentation. The fact that commercial strain added in that volume or that quantity, it's going to supercharge, ferment vigorously. You're not going to get that kind of built-in delay that you have with a natural fermentation, where it can take 3 to 4 days. And while you're just soaking on the skins, you get better color, more flavor drawn out of the skins. It's a soft start, and then as it builds, the natural yeast will slowly go through and work through the different strains that are kind of dominant at the different points of the fermentation. So each strain that comes in from nature, from the vineyard, adds a different array of flavor to the wine. So you just build in greater complexity just by the fact that you got all that clonal diversity and a slower fermentation. You don't have to worry about adding nutrients to feed the fermenter either, because there's kind of natural recycling that happens as one strain reaches its limit. They start to die off. The next strain that's stronger will take off and then kind of build off of the nutrients that are recycled back. And you basically get to the finish line with a wine that's going to ultimately be so much more stable that you really don't have to worry about unused nutrients. So when you're adding commercial yeast, you're adding like 1 million cells per milliliter. You have to feed them something, because there's just not enough nutrients in the grapes to kind of sustain and feed the yeast. And so a lot of winemakers will add diammonium phosphate and vitamins and add in large amounts to feed the yeast so that the fermentation can take place. And there's often an overshoot of nutrients that are left in the wine, and then later on in the life of the wine, you can have a lot of instability, from spoilage microbes.
So Eric,
so for us,
yeah. Go ahead. Oh, I was just
going to say that. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark.
So the question, so that people are, so what is the typical time frame, let's say on the Zinfandel based wines, for the natural yeast fermentation then?
They can go pretty quick. I mean, 7 days, 8 days. You may have like 3 to 4 days of no activity, and then suddenly it gets going. It will go really fast. So you have to really be very careful about the temperature on the fermenter, so we can cool it down with chilled water, and get it to the finish line and be ready to press off in 7 days is typically the full amount of time.
Great. Okay. And does that population of yeast, I think you studied this a little bit, Eric, change from year to year? Or
yeah, it has a lot to do with kind of the vectoring insect that bring the yeast to the vineyard. So, it depends on the health of the honeybee population, or the worst bug that vectors is the yellow jackets. They can carry yeast from their hive to the vineyard, and as they're eating the fruit, they're leaving behind deposits of yeast that overwinter in the hives. And so if you have a lot of honeybee and yellow jacket activity in the vineyard, you're going to see those ferments start much quicker. But generally, it's a probably the earliest I've ever seen a natural yeast fermentation start is within 24 hours, but generally it's more like 2 to 3 days, and it's certainly by the 4th day it's fully going.
Fantastic.
Yeah, there was a great study in New Zealand where they looked at wild bee populations and yeasts, and then actually looked at the yeasts that were fermenting in wineries. And the wineries that were using commercial yeast, you could actually find that commercial yeast the following year in bee populations that then kind of changed a little bit genetically, but then went out into vineyards and stuff. So it's a fascinating thing, and don't know a lot about it.
Yeah, so you worry about the contamination of commercial yeast stock getting out into the environment.
Yep.
We've done a lot of studies and isolated, and what we've seen is there's different categories of yeast that ferment. And you've got baking yeast, brewing yeast, wine fermenting yeast. A lot of the isolates that we've looked at and done genetic scans, genomic sequencing, we're within the family of wine fermenting yeast with what comes to us. And they're not very, from what we can identify down to that minute level, they're not associated with like main commercial yeast stock. So we're very lucky within the environments we're working and sampling that we're working with really, truly wild yeast.
That's great. So let's go back to the Boatman, sort of to wrap up the discussion about the Boatman wine, John. Now that you've been working with the vineyard for a bit more time since that 2015 vineyard, is there anything you've more that you've learned about that vineyard now that you've had a little more time to work with it?
Yeah, I mean, no question about it. You learn some of the idiosyncrasies of the various blocks. There's one sort of large flat block we call the front block, which behaves quite a bit differently, ripens a little differently than what you have up on the hillsides. Certainly learned that, especially on the hillsides, and David mentioned the one hillside that's sort of a little more west facing, the importance of really being ready to pick at the right moment, because it is 100% Zinfandel vineyard, and Zinfandel is a grape left out in the sun for just 1 or 2 extra days, the sugars can really skyrocket. And then you've got you've got a wine you've got grapes that are really headed towards making a wine that's really overripe, or certainly riper than the style of wines that we really like to make it rich. So the timing aspect of it, absolutely, that's been a big one.
Yeah, so a vineyard like Boatman, where it's on there's different topology, and there's maybe a little bit of difference in the soil from the different parts of the vineyard, figuring out when is the best time to harvest each of those blocks, something that takes a couple of years of experience working with the vineyard to totally figure out. So that's great. Okay, so I think with that, we're probably ready to go ahead and move on to the third wine, which is going to be the 2012 Lytton Estate Petite Syrah. And John, you've also been involved in making this wine, so maybe you can tell us about the Petite Syrah.
Sure. So Petite Syrah, well, first of all, for Ridge, Ridge has a long history with the grape, going back to 1971, I believe, was the first year we made York Creek Petite Syrah from Napa Valley, and we made that for many decades. And then in the early 1992, 93, we started experimenting a little bit with Petite Syrah as a varietal wine here at Lytton Springs. And we made a small amount in 02 and 03, and we're really, really impressed with the results. And so in 2009 was the first time we put out this wine, that is the Petite Syrah Lytton Estate. And what we found is that on the western side of the vineyard here at Lytton, the soils, there's lots of clay in there. The Petite Syrah really responds well and makes a wine which has all of character of Petite Syrah, which is to say lots of color, lots of tannin, very sort of intense in terms of a full-bodied red Rhone style wine. And yet, you know, we're able to get that at pretty reasonable ripeness, and we're able to, I think, achieve all the power of Petite Syrah, and yet there keeps sort of an elegance at the same time to the wine. So, you know, we've really been happy with it, and it's great now to be able to come back and take a look at it. We were talking a little bit before we started the video session about, you know, just how young the wine really tastes. I mean, it's, you know, it obviously has 1 or 2 more decades to go in terms of how it's going to evolve. So yeah, we really think we've got a pretty special place for growing Petite Syrah here at Lytton Springs. I mean, a couple things about the grape too, which, you know, we get the question because for good reason, is, you know, we're talking about Petite Syrah, and of course you have Syrah, and, you know, sort of what's the difference? So Petite Syrah, Syrah is one of the parents of Petite Syrah. So Petite Syrah is Syrah and Pelersen, which is a very little known grape from the Southern Rhone. So there's no question, you put them side by side and you definitely see a relationship. The color is quite similar. You have that intense tannin. You know, I would say in broad strokes, my take on it is that Petite Syrah is a little bit of, it's kind of the rustic brother to Syrah. You know, sometimes I like to say that if Syrah and Petite Syrah were like siblings, then Syrah is the brother that you know, leaves the farm and goes to the city, and Petite Syrah is the one that stays down on the farm. You know, that kind of comparison. So, but yeah, no, I think it's showing really beautiful.
So contrast the Lytton Estate Petite Syrah a little bit more, John, with the Petite Syrahs that historically Ridge was making from the York Creek Vineyard, which some were just labeled as York Creek, others were named after a specific block like Dynamite Hill or Devil's Hill. Talk about those, the compare and contrast those wines.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, there's some, you know, there's some differences in terms of vineyards. York Creek is up on hillside. It is, you know, the David can fill us in on this a lot more. It was a vineyard which, when you actually go back into the vineyard, you see that there's primarily Petite Syrah, but there's also some Syrah in there, and there's a couple of other related things. So it's maybe a little less pure Petite Syrah. I think that the York Creek wines were wines that I would sort of say lended themselves to making a wine that had this intense structure to it that I think most people found in the first 10 years really wasn't even something you wanted to get into. In other words, you really needed to give it an initial 10 years before the wine would even start to open up. I think with at Lytton Springs, as I mentioned earlier, I think, again, the site lends itself a little bit more to making a wine that is a little more approachable. I think it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, we can go back to the early 70s and we can taste some of the magnificent York Creek Petite Syrahs, which are still beautiful wines today at you know, 35, 40, 50 years. I think it'll be interesting to see. I think that I suspect we're going to be really surprised at how well these Petite Syrahs from Lytton Springs will age, even if they don't have the same character as the York Creek, especially at a young age.
And Eric, you were
Yeah.
involved in making a number of those York Creek Petite Syrahs.
Oh yeah.
Anything else
Yeah.
you want to add in terms of the
Oh
comparison?
my God. It was all about tannin management with that vineyard. I mean, it wanted to make a very gnarly, aggressively tannic wine. And so our job was to really slow down the extraction. In fact, there was a number of years we actually did a lot of whole cluster on some of the tanks that came in, where we weren't even running the fruit through the destemmer. We were just bringing the fruit right into the fermenter, laying the clusters down, crushing on top. And with that, getting even better, more gentle extraction and some really beautiful flavors from the kind of carbonic fermentation and the stem contact. But yeah, those Petite Syrahs from York Creek were definitely made to age. What I love about our Lytton Estate Petite Syrah, there's just so much more sumptuous. There's better fruit definition. The tannin quality is so much finer. I mean, I definitely see that as really being kind of the perfect site for Petite Syrah in this style is really just a good example of the variety.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we've all enjoyed about the Lytton Petite Syrah is that it is appealing when it's a young wine. And I think quite a bit more so than a number of the York Creek wines. And yet it is a wine that will clearly reward aging. And this wine will get there'll be complexity and there'll be depth and interest that'll happen with the wine over time, so that you really can decide what you want to do. You can drink it when it's younger and really enjoy the fruit expression, but you can also wait and see what happens as the wine ages and becomes more complex. So I think it's really indicative of the fact that the Lytton site is really a good site for growing Petite Syrah. And also probably one of the secrets or keys to what makes the Lytton Springs Zinfandel wine such a great wine as well is it always has that important component of Petite Syrah in it. And I think that is something that really adds a dimension to the Lytton Springs wine that is so important and why it stands out amongst other Zinfandels. So John, any thoughts for these? This is a 2012. How much longer do you think this wine would age?
I think the wine is going to hold up for 15 years from now. You know, and then it becomes more a question of taste. You know, in other words, some people like a wine that's even more resolved, but I think you know, I think with another 5 years we'll start to see it soften some. So I think it's going to add in terms of the enjoyment in being texturally a little more enjoyable. But yeah, it's got a lot of future ahead of it.
That's excellent. Okay, well, I think we're ready to move on to the final wine of the flight, which is going to be the 2010 Estate Cabernet. And Eric, why don't you tell us a little bit more
so
about
the
this?
baby Montebello, we call it.
Yeah.
So it's from Montebello. You know, it's from very special parts of the vineyard. You know, that just like Chardonnay, you know, where we have all this variation between high vigor, low vigor, water stress, or water availability. You know, the 45 parcels get split up, and really based on their history, you know, those that have always made a much elegant, more fruit forward, elegant wine, you know, we, from the very beginning, as the fruit comes into the winery, we're so much more delicate with the extraction. We really want to take those estate parcels and make a version of Montebello that has great complexity, but greater enjoyment as a younger wine. But as you can see, you know, this being a 2010, it also can age. It's just not going to be expected to age as long as Montebello. Like if we have the 2010 Montebello here right now to taste alongside it, the 10 Montebello is going to be very young. Whereas this is really evolved, and you know, it's just beginning to show some of the secondary aged element, the cedar, the kind of the nice red fruit, and you know, it's got a really gorgeous nose. And you know, this is really the perfect moment to enjoy this wine. Whereas the 2010 Montebello it's still kind of early yet to think about drinking it. It kind of needs at least another 2 to 3 years. Whereas this is just, you know, from the moment it was released in 2013 to now, it's just drinking so well. And it's from a great vintage here on the mountain. You know, 2010 was kind of a long winter, lots of rainfall, kind of a warm summer at times. That was the fateful vintage for Zinfandel, where we lost half our Zinfandel crop by the 2-day heat wave at the end of August. Here in Montebello, it didn't have any impact on the Bordeaux varieties. They got through that heat with no trouble. We're fortunate enough to be close enough to the ocean and the bay that it helped kind of buffer temperatures. And so we kind of got through that period of heat. And then we got into September, into October, and then had a number of storms come through. Never much rain, but just enough kind of cool and then warm. And, you know, we had this wild kind of oscillation through October where it kind of kept the fruit on the vine. It extended the hang time, allowed the tannins to get riper. And it really just made a very sensuous Cabernet. But of course, this is blended like Montebello, so it does include some Merlot. So we have 17% Merlot, 2 Petit Verdot, and 1 Franc. And the majority is Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's a really great drinking cab at this point. And aged in American oak, like Montebello, we generally, with this being a little bit more about fruit, we don't throw 100% new oak on this wine like we do Montebello. Montebello's got so much intensity, it can handle 100% new oak and integrate it nicely. This wine here, we kind of take it down to about 50 to 60% new, and then some 1-year and 2-year-old barrels. And then we usually let this wine rest in barrel for a bit longer than Montebello, so we can ensure that the tannins have really settled out, resolved, and you know, we'll do a later bottling and then give it some bottle age before release so that it's really at a good place to drink when it's released in the springtime. So this would have gone out to the market in spring of 2013. Oh, and it's beautiful. It's got all the great dimension of, you know, what cab brings to the blend, which is going to be good structure, you know, blue fruit. The Merlot brings the higher tone berry, kind of more towards the cherry, you know, elegant tannin. And then the small amount of Petit Verdot and Franc is really just in there just to give the wine a little bit more array of flavor. I like Cabernet Franc for kind of the nice spice that it has. And in terms of its character, it really does kind of show more of a cool climate growing environment where it's more kind of mountain fruit, little hints of herbaceousness that I find really attractive, kind of like, you know, black olive and a little bit of tobacco, some juniper berry. So it's a really highly scented, pungent wine with now some nice resolved tannins.
Yeah, I agree, Eric. I think the aromatics on this particular wine are really jump out. I mean, I think 2010 was, there were a lot of wines. 2010 was kind of a bizarre vintage. It was the vintage that stopped in the middle of ripening and then started again. But no, really amazing.
And then, you know, with having kind of that cool weather after the 2-day heat wave, we kind of went into a slump with temperature, and then slowly came back towards the end of October. And it's when you get that late season heat, it really has such a positive effect on the fruit character in the grapes, which then comes into the wine, you know, in translation. So it's really just a deeply scented wine here, real classic. You know, vintage I love drinking. I mean, I try to drink 2010 Montebello, but it's, you know, I don't want to open too many bottles in my cellar because that's really going to be long-lived. This is nice. You know what I actually found a lot in my cellar recently, I was digging through to find some bottles. Found a lot of the York Creek Petite Syrahs that I just have not opened, you know, that go back to the 90s. Just again, it's, you just know those wines really need such long aging. So those are really the boxes I haven't touched much.
So Eric, when you're over time, you've kind of developed a sense for certain blocks at Montebello that, by their nature, by their location, by whatever factors, tend to produce fruit that goes into the estate, and then other blocks that tend to produce fruit that goes into the Montebello. And then there's some that are kind of the ones that maybe go back and forth depending on the particular year. So talk a little bit more about that selection process and what you're looking for.
Well, that kind of goes with the long history of working here and knowing the pieces of the vineyard and the mountain, you know, where we're growing, and just, we're not on a flat piece of ground here. So we've got extreme terrain. It's a true mountain vineyard. And so with that, you have a lot of variation in just where water resources reach vines. As water travels downhill through the fissures, you're going to have spots where water wicks up through the rock, and those vines growing on that section of the vineyard are going to have greater vigor. The berries are going to be juicier. The vines are going to be, you know, bushier and have more leaves. And so the fruit from those pockets on the vineyard are really going to have varying results in the wine. And so just recognizing that the vineyard over the time, there are these areas that have to be carved out, and the wine made very, very carefully to be made as the estate. So it's all really about, from the very beginning, the fruit coming in, sorting the berries, sorting the fruit in the fermenter, being extremely gentle with the amount of irrigation that we do as far as pump overs. So we're not trying to over extract tannin. We really want to come out of the fermenter with those lots that are destined for the estate to have really nice, soft, round tannins and really good fruit definition. So again, just being here this long, knowing the areas, the most stressed sites and the smaller berries with greater color and tannin tend to be those that make Montebello. Those that are juicier berries that are going to end up being softer tannin are what we'll send to the estate production. But it's never guaranteed. So it really can still be influenced by the growing conditions of that year. You know, when we were in the drought period of 5 years, there actually was a number of blocks that moved more towards producing wine of intensity and structure for Montebello. And then in the wetter years, it kind of moves more towards making more estate. So we really see what kind of growing season we have. As we're approaching harvest, we're out in the vineyard, we're tasting the fruit, we're looking at the vine water status and making these separations between the high vigor and the low vigor. And then once it's in the winery picked and in the fermenter, we pump over and we really start to taste the flavors. We see how it extracts and then make that final determination of what direction to send it, towards Montebello or towards the estate production.
So Dave Gates, what would you say are some of the key things to making sure we get the best quality fruit from the Montebello vineyard? What are some of the things maybe that are especially unique to the vineyard site that you lose sleep about sometimes to make sure that things are going to go right?
Well, I do remember 2010. It's the last vintage that we picked into November, up on the hill here. No, the main thing here at Montebello is monitoring and managing crop load on the vines. You know, the vines, some years they struggle to grow. Like this year, I don't think we're going to get a lot of growth on the vines because we're so low in water. And so we have to make sure that we don't have too much fruit that sets on the vines. And because we just can't get it ripe. It's very different from down in the valley or other areas of California. It's, mountain vineyards are unique that way. You really can't, the vines do struggle, and I think that comes out in the fruit. The fruit is very intense. Even in this estate cab that was the softer lots of grapes, it still is pretty robust wine. I think it's softened up now, but to me, it's got another 10 years to go. I like my Cabernets on the aged side a little bit, but yeah. So that's probably the biggest thing. And then to do that, you know, the whole thing with growing grapes is manipulation anyway. Because grapes want to grow up in trees and produce lots of tiny little clusters with just a few berries that are attractive to birds, so that the birds will eat them and then scatter the seeds out all over. So what we're trying to do is make them grow into a regimented way down rows, so we can take care of them and get a little bit more uniform clusters out of them. And so to do that, you have to kind of trick them and do things that you want them to do, instead of just kind of growing wild. So that, and there are books written on this, and people have been doing it for millennia. And that's, you just try to basically create a balanced mind, because that's what gives you balanced fruit, and that's what will give you a balanced wine that you can drink young or let it age for a while.
Still have problems with those birds coming after your fruit, huh, Dave?
Yeah, but birds are good, because you know that old adage about birds and bees. Well, a bird is going after the seed in the grape, so it pecks it. Well, that releases some sugar, so then the bees go after the sugar. They leave the yeast, and that ferments the wine in the wine. So it's all good.
You kind of count on that whole the circle of life.
Exactly.
So when you go to UC Davis, that's what they teach you about the birds and the bees, huh?
Yes. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. It's really important how we depend on all these different aspects of nature to give us the fruit that's going to produce these kind of wines, and that things like bees and birds and all the other things going on out there in the vineyard really have an important role to play. So that's pretty interesting. John, any thoughts that you might have on the Montebello vineyard? And you know, you've certainly spent some time there as well. Tell us what you think makes it such a special place.
Well, I mean, you know, really great wines tend to come down to, you know, location, obviously, you know. So when you have the right varietal, you've got the right climate, and you've got the right soil perfectly matched, you make great things. And it sounds really simple, just three things, but when you think of the multitude in terms of the variety of different types of soil, different types of climate, different types of varietals, different types of clones of varietals, rootstock, or the whole thing, I think it's just the fact that all of those things really come together in one unique situation that really makes it so special. I mean, to me, that's at the heart of it. You know, the fact is that it's pretty rare that sort of triangle, if you will, perfectly aligns, and it does at Montebello.
Yeah.
Well, I think
and the kind of the intellect behind that, and you know, thinking about what to plant, how to farm, how to bring it in, ferment it, the dedication then of everyone that's working in the cellar here to really promote the quality, you know, take these high quality grapes in, treat it carefully, and make really high quality wine and be able to get to bottle. It's a huge undertaking that we've been now doing for almost 60 years here at Ridge. You know, from the very beginning, the founders were really dedicated to that and really putting a lot of thought behind what to plant and how to make it.
And I think that's an important point, because another sign of what an excellent spot we have at Montebello is the fact that wine has been made, you know, from Montebello by Ridge, as you say, for almost 60 years. The original founders having released the first vintage in 1962, first commercial vintage, but actually had made a little bit of wine as early as 1959. And the fact that the wines have just shown such consistency over such a long period of time. And we also know a little bit of the history of the site when others were growing grapes there prior to Prohibition. The wines that were being made achieved a lot of notoriety. You know, some wines that Pierre Klein made from down at the Jim Samir Ranch actually won some gold medals around the turn of the century in year 1900, and took his wines to France and gained a lot of acclaim as well. So I think it's, you know, we're just blessed with having an incredible site for growing the Bordeaux varietals at Montebello, and are able to produce these wines on such a consistently high level year after year. There is a lot of work that goes into doing that. It's not automatic. It's not a given. But I think with what you guys have been able to do, it just shows what a wonderful place we have in terms of the vineyard site. So I think with that, we're going to wrap up the tasting. We've reached the end of our hour together today. And again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. We will be doing another seminar next Thursday. And as I mentioned earlier, the focus on that seminar will be completely Chardonnay. So if we didn't have time to get to answer all your questions today about Chard, for sure, sign up and tune in to the seminar next week. And I think with that, we'll say cheers and see everyone again, hopefully next Thursday.